Okay, well, I have no idea why I'm doing this, but all of my gigs have been canceled for the foreseeable future, and why not? So, I'm gonna start with some G major. Nice warm-up key, at least I think. Not comfortable key signature, mid-range. And I tend to practice my scales more free-form. So instead of da 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 blah 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 blah, I try to practice some full range. So from the tonic up to the highest note, down to the lowest note, and back up. But I also try to switch it up a little bit, so you'll hear a lot of going up halfway, going down, then going up a little more. I can't really explain it. Anyway, I have no idea why you'd want to watch this, but here it is. The low G on this instrument tends towards the sharp side, so especially when I'm coming down from the mid-range, I have to be careful not to be too high on that. And that was only up to the high E. On this, I recently did some tweaks on this contrabassoon that overall help, but it also negatively impacted the highest F sharp and G. So they don't come out quite as cleanly as they used to, but I'm going to try to fix that in the future. I don't know what the double reed discord is. You'll have to explain that a little further. For the best gamer of ever 23, this is a Mollenhauer. This is owned by the Symphony of Northwest Arkansas, but it kind of lives with me full time. gave me fits for the longest time on this instrument. And you'll see that I actually installed or added a extension for the water key, which happens to function as a vent for that note on this instrument, just to make it a little more reliable. So without that key, if I try to slur from G to A, okay, so now it's working more often than not, but of course in music, when you're playing that slur, for example, Beethoven 9 has that slur in one section, 90% isn't good enough, so. Switch over to G sharp. Now I'm going to start off slowly here, mainly for intonation. The half whole A flat on contrabassoons is a very wonky note. The octave vents on this system just are not in the perfect spot, and that goes for pretty much or most contrabassoons, not unique to this one. And the intonation of that half whole G sharp is very dependent on this linkage right here. If this cork is too thin, this key will leak or this tone hole will leak too much with a half hole. When you half hole, if it's thick, if it's a little bit thicker, it won't leak at all. And on some contrabassoons, that's good. On this one, it needs a little bit of leak here. So on my instrument, that A flat tends to be a little bit bimodal. It wants to either be 10 cents flat or like 30 cents sharp. So getting it in the exact spot you want it is a challenge. Just asked, is the intonation on that G sharp bad for similar reasons as it is as on bassoon? On all reed instruments, the positioning of the octave vents is a compromise. It's never going to be perfect. The only way for the intonation across octaves to be perfect would be if you had 12 octave vents, one for each note of the chromatic scale. But since you can't really do that effectively, there's going to be little tweaks. The contrabassoon has more of those tweaks and insufficiencies than the bassoon does. But the bassoon has them, the saxophone has them, clarinet has them, oboe has them, certainly. Yeah, so you can hear right there that G sharp was a little bit flat. Now, when it comes to the use of the octave key on the G sharp, that can, it depends on the instrument, and honestly, sometimes it just depends on how the reed is doing. So, if I add that G sharp, or add that octave key to the G sharp, you can hear that it can go really sharp. But depending on how the reed's feeling that day, you might need that extra boost. It's always, when I'm finding or looking for fingerings, my goal is to find a fingering that I can play in tune with an open sound. So if I have to pinch using colloquial, or it's a misnomer, but you all should probably know what I mean. If I have to voice something up, that tends to negatively impact the sound, whereas if I get to when I can voice it down, that's probably, if I can voice it down, that I can get a better sound. So sometimes sharp is better. And yes, that is a drone I have in the background for intonation purposes. Sorry, I just realized now that that's probably really annoying when I'm talking. So if I add the octave key, it's definitely easy for it not to be flat, but I have to fight to keep it down. So normally I don't use the octave key unless it's like an octave to octave slur. But even then I have to be careful. If my water vent, so I talked about that water key extension that I use sometimes. I also have to use it for the high F, the top of treble clef F, and if that vent gets clogged by condensation, it doesn't come out. Since I did that work on the contrabassoon, I'm also noticing that high E flat is drifting sharp, much more so than it used to. So somewhere there's some change I did is also affecting that. So I might need to find another fingering for that. So Snow M6 wants me to shout out the double reed Discord. I don't personally know what that is, so go at your own. If it's, well, he asked me to shout it out, and it sounds like a good thing. So if you're on Discord, it might be worth checking out. And this is a good example of why bassoon and contrabassoon, why I so strongly advocate for full range scales. So on A flat major, when you're down at the bottom, if you just play octave to octave, you're leaving out one of the hardest parts of the scale, which is that the slurring from E flat to D flat, low E flat to B flat. So if you play bassoon, you know that that's any scale that involves that slur is challenging. So by practicing your scales full range, you're ensuring that you're getting as much practice on those tricky intervals as possible. This also goes for the highest notes in the scale, in each scale. Is you don't really have to worry about practicing natural minor scales, because it's kind of included in the, it's just, if you're practicing a full range C major scale, then you've essentially already practiced a full range A minor scale. You're just starting and stopping on different notes. But it is worth, especially on the harmonic minors. So the unique thing about the harmonic minor is you have some augmented seconds there that aren't in any of the major scales. So it is, well, that's probably a relief for a moment. It is, I would recommend when you do practice, or as you practice your major, your minor scales, spend a little bit of extra energy on those unique parts of the harmonic and melodic minor scale. Slur from E to F double sharp to G sharp is something that doesn't happen in any of the major scales. Likewise, for the melodic minors, you would focus on the 5, 6, 7, 1, 7, 6, 5. Notice the F sharp going down is kind of a wonky note on this instrument. I normally use the front fingering for that half whole F sharp for better intonation and better sound, but on scales sometimes you need to use the technically more convenient fingering. So in the case of G sharp minor, since you have, in the case of G sharp melodic minor, since you have A sharp, G sharp, F sharp, the only way to avoid sliding a finger is by using the thumb F sharp, even if you avoid it in normal situations. So this is A. And this also has the issue I was talking about before, where you have F, G sharp in a row. So if I were doing a kind of like a slow melodic passage, I probably would slide the pinky between these two keys. But on a scale for a technical passage, I want to use the thumb F sharp. Now in A major on bassoon, this is where I would actually use the front F sharp and then the thumb G sharp. You know, that key on the back of the instrument that you never use. It comes in very handy for A major and A major and E major. This contrabassoon does not have that thumb G sharp key. So there's the low E key, B flat key, F sharp key. There's an alternate E flat key that I use as my main E flat key, and then this is where the thumb G sharp key would be. So you can hear right there, that's why I don't normally use that thumb F sharp. Because it tends very sharp. The front F sharp is also sharp, but it tends to be more flexible. But if you're playing like the what is that from Beethoven 9? Having the technique is more important than the intonation of every individual note. So Juan asked, when am I going to finish the sub-contrabassoon project? Well, since there's pretty much no one in the shop right now, that was my plan for this week. However, over the weekend there was a little minor fire, so I can't really work in the shop at the moment. It wasn't bad. It was actually, the fire was just a few inches away from where I normally store some of the sub-contrabassoon body joints, but I had luckily taken them home a few weeks earlier to take a picture. So nothing irreplaceable was lost. Right now they're just working and cleaning up the shop. So that's why I'm not in the shop right now working on the sub-contrabassoon. wanted to have fun, I could get out my low A bell, but it would take a few minutes to switch, so I'll leave that for another time. Jacob, I'll get to your question in a little bit. So this is the less familiar register of the contrabassoon. So as you can tell, I have not spent quite as much time up here on technical work as I should. Treble clef E is not a note the contrabassoon was designed for. So if I'm slurring from the D, it just barely comes out. If I need to articulate it, I actually have to once again add the water key, but that also pushes it very sharp. Voice it down. You can also hear there's a good reason why the water key is not usually used as a key, because it that's where the water collects. So if you do need to use it for some problematic notes, like I need to use it for high A, high E, high F, and the high F sharp. This is treble clef, E, F, and F sharp. You have to be very careful to empty that out. Otherwise, you're gonna best case scenario, you're gonna get that gurgling sound. Worst case scenario, the note's not gonna come out. So Jacob asked, what's my take on the Amati contrabassoons? I have played one Amati in the past 10 years, and that was a few months back at Vocal Majority in Dallas. It was fine. I mean, I guess my opinion is if you're going to spend $10,000 on a contrabassoon, as an individual, if you're going to spend $10,000 on a contrabassoon, it's worth spending $20,000 on a Mollenhauer or $30,000 on a Fox. If you're in like an educational environment, like let's say you're a high school that wants to show off that it has a contrabassoon, or you're a college where or buying instruments for a college, I think it makes more sense. I also know that some people have used them very successfully for getting started. So like if you're a freelance contrabassoonist, the challenge that you face is you can spend a lot of money renting instruments and hoping that they're even available. So I like my Mollenhauer. If I were buying my own, like I said, this is owned by the Symphony of Northwest Arkansas, I would lean towards a Mollenhauer. Personally, the Foxes are very well made as well, but the Amatis, there's a lot of old information out there from like 15 years ago when the Amatis were honestly pretty terrible. So when you find, it's better if you're looking for information about the Amatis, it's better to get information from people that have played them in like the last 5 years. I'm still not terribly impressed, but I can understand why the savings would be worth it for some people. Actually, so in A minor you have that F, and you might notice, well, you can only see my left hand, but that's a bizarre fingering that I use by default on the F. I actually finger F, the open F, like the low F, except with the second finger off. On this instrument, it works great. On most other instruments, it doesn't work. But it's a pretty common issue on contrabassoons that open F is either very flat, very sharp, or somehow both at the same time. So, like if I play open F the way that you're supposed to, or the way that the contrabassoon was designed for. That's like 30 cents flat. And kind of going back to what I was talking about beforehand, a fingering that's 20 cents sharp, that's something that you can correct by changing your voicing in ways that tends to improve the sound, whereas something that's 30 cents flat, that's something that that ends up negatively impacting the sound. So if I try to bring that in tune, not only does that change the sound, but it also makes a very awkward, so if I were trying to go from E to F, that big of tuning discrepancies between notes, it's sometimes unavoidable, but it is something you should be on the lookout. Contrabassoon, since they are so individual, they're not standardized from one instrument to the other. A Fox contrabassoon feels very different than a Mollenhauer, and even two different Mollenhauers of different years feel very different from one another. You can, it's important to keep an open mind with fingerings. You're going to need to do some experimentation. If you're used to playing bassoon, then your teacher's probably given you a fingering chart, and those are the fingerings to use. There might be some alternates that you use in certain situations, but bassoons leave the factory with those fingerings in mind. Like before a bassoon leaves the factory, people play high G on it to make sure that that note works with the standard fingering. On contrabassoon, there aren't standard fingerings, so you're going to need to be open to more experimentation. So like that open F, or that F that I use is weird, doesn't work on most contrabassoons, but on this instrument it works wonderful. It lets me play open F with a similar voicing that I do the E and the D below, so I'm not having to do a whole bunch of just to get it in tune. A lot of contrabassoonists actually use a half-hole F. On this instrument, that's wildly sharp. Jacob asked if there's any way for me to buy reeds. I personally don't sell contrabassoon reeds. I don't have a efficient enough contrabassoon reed making setup. And I also don't have a lot of advice for where to buy them because I haven't bought reeds. I think I bought 2 contrabassoon reeds in my life. That was like in 2002. Neither of them worked. So I just started figuring out how to reinvent the wheel. I may do some reed making tutorials during this time that I don't have anything else to do. No, I don't sell reeds directly, and I also unfortunately don't have any recommendations. That is one thing I thought about doing on the channel, just going out and buying 10 contrabassoon reeds and playing through them, haven't gotten around to that yet. And now with all these gigs canceled, probably not the best time to be buying $200 worth of contrabassoon reeds. Yeah, so Larry asks, what are the differences in tone hole placement from the bassoon? I know the fingerings are slightly different, but are there big tone holes? Are the big tone holes placed the same as bassoon? The contrabassoon, more so than any of the other auxiliary woodwinds, is acoustically distinct from its parent instrument. So the bassoon has a lot of tone holes that are positioned for the sake of the human hand. So you have like those left-hand tone holes that are very long. They're at these weird angles just to fit it on the human hand. The Baroque contrabassoon was like that, except because the instrument's twice as long and the human hand is not twice as big, they had to be twice as extreme in order to work. So as the contrabassoon has been refined over the years, they've kind of abandoned most of those very long angled tone holes in favor of these shorter tone holes. Now they're still a little bit longer, like there's still a wing on this wing joint, a thick part, and that tone hole does go through that, but it's much less pronounced than on bassoon, which is why a lot of the fingerings, you can't just use bassoon fingerings on contrabassoon and expect them to work. Sometimes it does. Like, I have no idea why, but the fingering for high G sharp that I use is almost exactly to the fingering that I use on bassoon. But that's a coincidence, not a design feature. All right, let's get back to some A minor. Comfortable slur on this contrabassoon with the fingerings. I have to use high F to high G sharp. That A sharp tends, sorry, did I say A sharp? I meant G sharp. That G sharp tends quite a bit sharp, and that F I have to add all of the right hand to stabilize it. Speaking of registers that I have to use some weird fingerings, down in this register, on the Mollenhauer vocal that this instrument came with, low F was fine. On this Heckel vocal that I've switched to now, 99% of the instrument is better, except that low F is sharp. And so what I end up, for whatever reason, adding the low E flat key helps that fingering for low F. So if I try to play it without, here I'll put on an F drone for a second, so you can hopefully hear that a little better. And that's actually not as sharp as it was, or as I remember it being. But adding that E flat, the low E flat key, turns a fight into a very comfortable, I can just play the note and not have to worry about it. Likewise, the low D, if I play it using normal fingerings, quite a bit sharp. It's also a little bit stuffy. But on this instrument, and a lot of contrabassoonists do this, by the way, if I add the low C sharp key, you would expect it to raise the pitch, and it does very slightly, but it also makes it much less stuffy. So you've raised the pitch by a few cents, but you've also increased your flexibility by so much that it counteracts that. So those are the default fingerings I use for low F with the low E flat key and low D with the low C sharp key. And even with that fingering, low D tends to be a little bit sharp, but it's easier to bring down. So when I'm practicing my contrabassoon scales, as distinct from my bassoon scales, that's something I want to focus on, is the scales that involve a lot of these low register notes with unfamiliar fingerings. I want to practice that and practice that slowly. It also means that, unfortunately, if I'm going from D to E flat, I need to slide the pinky. So sometimes, if it's very fast, I'll leave that off. But my goal on bassoon and contrabassoon is you find the best fingerings, and unless there's a very good reason not to, you use those fingerings. You know, there are obviously situations where the full fingering is simply impractical, and if you insisted on using it, you would end up sounding worse overall. But you want to make sure, before you use a cheap fingering, you want to make sure that that's the situation, that you cannot use the full fingering. So Hunter asked, just how different are the contrabassoon fingerings from regular bassoon fingerings? If a bassoon player picked up a contra, would it be a difficult switch? So it has a completely different octave mechanism. Easier in some aspects, harder in others. But if you're playing in kind of the what I would consider the basic range, which is from low B flat up to high G, then most of the fingerings are going to be pretty similar. You might need some to modify those fingerings depending on the instrument. It's kind of what I've been talking about. Some of the keys I have to add to low F, low D. I haven't talked about it, but I also have to add some fingerings for the upper register notes. So like if I try to play D above the staff, normally, which is just 1, 2, and then the upper octave key, if I voice it high and kind of play it the way that I don't want to have to play it, it'll come out. But in the process of doing that, it's also like 30 cents sharp. But I found that on this instrument, if I add 2 and 3 on the right hand, I can play that note comfortably, reliably, and in tune without having to fight it down. Like the worst situation to find yourself in on bassoon and contrabassoon is like a note that's on the verge of cracking, but it's also sharp. So those two things kind of counteract each other. If I voice it lower, that's going to make it more likely to crack. But if I voice it higher, it's going to get sharper. But the basic fingerings in that register, low B flat to third ledger line G, are not that different than contrabassoon. And if you practice the instrument as it deserves to be practiced, then it shouldn't be too much of a challenge if you're already a established bassoon player. The upper register is completely 100% different, or it's only incidentally similar. Every like 10th note might be somewhat similar to bassoon, but that's an accident, not a design feature. So if you have the opportunity to learn contrabassoon, I highly encourage it. I love the contrabassoon, but you definitely need to go into it with the right attitude. It's not like if you're a clarinet player, if you're a good clarinet player and someone hands you a bass clarinet, you can play most of the range of the instrument and it's going to sound pretty okay. Like, bass clarinet specialist is still a highly valuable thing, and I'm not trying to discount the work that they do to bring the bass clarinet from 90% to 100%. But on contrabassoon, just picking up a contrabassoon as a bassoonist, you're more at like 50%. So there's a wider gap to fill in of contrabassoon specific knowledge. Harrison asks, is B flat 0 through B flat 1 more accessible to contrabassoon than tuba? A tuba player might be in the audience and they're gonna come in and say, well, I can play down to B flat 0, no problem whatsoever, any day of the week. My argument would be yes. Those extreme bottom of the piano notes are more accessible on contrabassoon. They're more reliable. They're better in tune. Now, that's not great, but they are better in tune. And they can also be sustained longer. A lot of times when you're writing down with these incredibly low notes, you want it to last a little while. Because, if you just play a staccato low B flat, that's hardly enough time for the ear to even connect with that sound and identify it as a note. So on contrabassoon, a note like a low B flat, or even let's take a note that would be worse on tuba, a low B. And that's much more sustained than you're going to get from a tuba. Now, yes, the tuba can play down in this register and even lower. The tuba can theoretically play as low as the sub-contrabassoon I'm planning on building. But there's a reason why those notes are so rarely used orchestrally on the tuba. Because it's just not as accessible as they are on contrabassoon. Okay. Let's just go ahead and go to B flat. might be a good time to talk about the E flat. On contrabassoon, the main E flat key is right here between the normal left-hand 2 and 3 keys. But that's pretty inconvenient in most circumstances. For example, let's say I was going from C to E flat. Or even more usefully, C sharp to D sharp. So one of the most useful additions you can have on a contrabassoon is an alternate E flat key of some sort. Mine has an alternate thumb key for the E flat, and that's what I use 90% of the time, is the thumb key. So you can see this this tone hole moving, but I'm not sliding my fingers. There are still situations where you would want to use this 1, 2 and the E flat key fingering, but generally I find that the alternate fingerings are kind of an easier default solution. Here's another situation where I would personally need to think about using the thumb F sharp, or G flat in this instance, because going from low F, open F, middle F, just in the staff F, to front G flat requires kind of sliding my pinky forward. Well, it's still not going to be able to see it, but so that's with the thumb fingering, and with kind of pushing the pinky forward. Now, that thumb fingering is so less than ideal on this instrument that I try to practice it both ways, because there are sometimes you need to be able to do that slide. There's a nasty slur on Contra. The G flat to high A. Now that is maybe worth mentioning. So whenever you're, one reason why you want to try to avoid sliding the pinky, or sliding a finger, when you let go of a key, because your finger is releasing with that key, the key tends to close or open relatively slowly. Like your finger is controlling how fast that is. But when you slide off of a key, that key tends to slam shut. So you can really hear that in the going from low E flat to low D flat. As I slide off the low E flat, because my finger's not following the key, I'm gonna get a click. And sometimes that's kind of unavoidable. The reason that happens is you're not going to be able to see it on this video, but the spring for this key is just gigantic, and it needs to be. Because these holes, E flat and C sharp, these are sprung closed. They're not closed by your finger pressure, which means if in order to play lower than that, if that spring tension isn't enough, that tone hole is going to leak, and you're not going to be able to play lower than that, or maybe you can play lower but not softly. So just another thing to keep in mind when you're considering alternate fingerings. If you need to be very soft, especially if it's like a solo situation, it doesn't really apply so much in the orchestra because there's 900 other noises on stage that aren't related to you. But in like a recording situation, when I have a mic a few inches from me, that's a lot more noticeable. So Harrison asked, he has a part he's writing, and he wants a repeating quarter note D really loud. So would giving that to the contrabassoon be better than giving it to the tuba? If it needs to be really loud, D is the low D. When you get to that range, that's when the tuba starts kind of losing some of its power. Personally, unless you're going for like an all woodwind texture or an all brass texture, my suggestion would be to use them both in unison. I think the tuba would give you more volume, but the contrabassoon would give you more articulation at the beginning of the note, whereas the tuba might be more of a whoa as the note settles in. With the reed on the contrabassoon, it's going to be, you know, bah, but maybe not quite as much volume as once the tuba gets going. So that would be my suggestion, but I think good tuba players and good contrabassoon players would be able to do that reasonably equally well. That would be my thought. Okay, B minor, or B major. Yeah, I'm going to use the upper octave drone. Now, on both bassoon and contrabassoon, if you wanted my suggestion on one of the trickiest technical areas, it's this one right here. When you need to play D sharp, C sharp, B, A sharp. So any scale that you work on that has that collection of notes in it, it's worth spending a little bit of time in the low register, because if any composers are out there, the worst thing you can do to a bassoonist is have a whole bunch of low D sharps and C sharps and B's and A sharps, all that thummy stuff. Now, in the case of bassoon, a lot of times the approach I would suggest is give it to the contrabassoon, because there's this passage in Mahler 1 that it's written for the third bassoon to play, and it's like low E flat, D flat, C repeated. And on contrabassoon it's easy, but of course since the contrabassoonist isn't playing bassoon there, they're playing third bassoon, it's that craziness. So sometimes if you're writing in that kind of just below bass clef with a lot of flats areas, you might have better luck writing for contrabassoon, because they get to play that an octave higher, with the key with the fingers that woodwinds are designed to play, not the thumb and pinky mess. So ratchet, as a base rule, anytime someone accidentally calls me Roger, I take it as a compliment. Any of you who don't know, Roger Bobo was a very famous tuba player. One of the people that really defined artistry on the tuba. I wish I could claim that we were, cousins or something, but best I can figure from looking at family trees is that we are adopted 7th cousins. So essentially not related. But yeah, it happens at least 5 times a season where a brass player comes up to me and says, "Oh, hey, Richard." And I always take it as a compliment. So I Am Peridot asks how you disassemble the instrument. Well, it's really complicated. You take the bocal out. Depending on the instrument, sometimes you take off the tuning slide, and then you put it in the case. It's not like a bassoon. You don't disassemble everything. Disassembling a contrabassoon is like a week-long affair. You need to reseal the joints with silicone sealant. It's generally all stays in one piece. I personally recommend to remove the tuning slide when you store the instrument because a lot of moisture gets collected in this area. So by removing that, you've removed a big source of remaining moisture from the instrument so that it's not soaking in the case. Now, this is something that not a lot of people know about, and I'm kind of surprised. So the bassoon, the wing joint, and the part of the boot joint are lined with rubber. That way they're protected from water, from moisture. Now, I should say partially protected from moisture. A lot of the tone holes aren't lined, so you still have to be careful. But that goes a long way to protecting the instrument from wood rot. The contrabassoon, none of these wooden pieces are lined with rubber, usually people just don't worry about it. But if you've ever disassembled a contrabassoon, you might have seen that there can be quite a bit of gunk and wood rot on the wooden side. So this is the contrabassoonist Chris King sells these. This is a contrabassoon wing joint swab. What it is it's a piece of kind of rubber tubing, kind of slightly thicker, or stiff enough to go up, but not so stiff that you wouldn't want to make it out of metal because then you're kind of risking damaging this top U-bend as you push it all the way in and jam it in there. So I personally cannot think of any reason not to use this or something like this every time before you put the instrument up. Kind of like on bassoon. You keep the instrument upright as long as you play it, and then the first thing you do before you put it in the case, before you lay it horizontally, is you swab it out. That way that moisture that's collected in the bottom of the instrument doesn't migrate to the unlined portion of the board. Contrabassoon has the same issues. We have this bottom tube here that collects moisture, but we still want to swab that out before we lay it down. Or that would be my suggestion. Theo asks, why is the Contra not designed to come apart like the bassoon does? Well, you're dealing with a very large instrument, and which massively increases the number of places that leaks could happen. So by not taking it apart, you've made it more likely that it can be sealed with silicone sealant and then just kind of left like that. And that way you don't have to worry about it leaking as much as if you disassembled it. However, I should say there is a recent development in Contrabassoon that I haven't been able to try yet, but I'm really looking forward to. This is the Kronwald Contrabassoon. It's a collaboration between Wolf and wait, want to make sure I get this not right. Yes, between Wolf and Walter. That could be Wolf and Walter. I don't know. They're spelled with W's. I don't know how German these companies are. But here, let me pull up a picture. So if we go, oh, gonna get a bit of inception there. So here we can see a contrabassoon that's been designed to come apart in kind of the middle. And what this does is it allows it to fit in a considerably smaller case. It also gives you easy access to the inside of the instrument for cleaning. It also has some very exciting keywork developments. So this is the contrabassoon that I really want to try. So hopefully IDRS happens this year so that I have a chance to try it out, because I've heard a lot of good things about it. That's the Kronwald Contrabassoon by Wolf and Walter. Yes, Ratchet. This is because of the virus, because there's nothing else for me to do. Every gig I had is canceled for the indefinite future. Ratchet. So I get that question a lot about the Contraforte, so much that I actually have planned a separate video just talking about it. So keep an eye on the channel for that. I am Peridot asks, my bell joint is metal. My bell was metal. So this is the bell that came with the instrument. However, I replaced that with a 3D printed ABS bell because I wanted to be able to use, I also have the 3D printed low A and low G bells, and by using one system of bell attachment, it lets me to go back and forth between those easily. Okay, so back to B. Sorry, I'll get back to scales. Actually, you all probably more interested in hearing me talk than hearing me practice scales. But one of the main reasons why I disassembled the instrument recently is to work on the intonation on that B and C in the upper octave. Well, actually, in both octaves, they were drifting flat, like quite a bit. So it's a lot better than it used to be. It feels a lot more secure. Sorry, I just thought about that when I was going up to that B. resistant in this uppermost register. Thankfully, you play... I've never gotten paid to play in this register. Nothing up here has ever showed up in my orchestra music, but when it does, I want to be ready for it. Yeah, and you can hear that gurgling I was talking about earlier as the water has built up in that water key that you're not supposed to use as a key, but I have to for some of these crazy notes. So that was up to the high F sharp at the treble clef. So there, I was still in B major mode, so I went to the thumb fingering for F sharp, but since we're in B minor now, I don't have to. I can use the good fingering with the front pinky. So, I don't know if I'm going to pronounce this correctly. So, well, Ratchet asks how common is tenor clef writing, and Artemio says tenor clef is not that common for Contra. I would be a little more nuanced than that and say that the register that would necessitate tenor clef is not common on Contra. So, as a result, tenor clef is pretty uncommon. Like 99% of your day-to-day contrabassoon stuff is going to be in the G, so third ledger line above bass clef, G, and below. Above that, there's, like an extra octave, but it appears so very, very uncommonly. If you do write it in this register, I would very much suggest that you use tenor clef just like you would on bassoon. Bassoonists, we don't want to read high C's in bass clef, and I don't know why we would want to read them on contrabassoon either. So if you do write up in this register, and once again, or I should stress, be careful, because not all contrabassoon... let me be careful here. A lot of times the contrabassoon ends up being played by a bassoonist who is looking for a gig, rather than a contrabassoonist who has dedicated a significant amount of practice to the contrabassoon as its own unique instrument. So when you write up in the high B flat, high C, high D area, there's a fairly high chance that you have to be prepared for the possibility that the part will be played by someone who has never played up there before, because it happens so rarely, and so many contrabassoon parts get played by people who don't really practice the contrabassoon. So I would caution there. Artemio, that is completely accurate. That if most contrabassoon writing doesn't use tenor clef, but I think it's worth stressing the reason for that, rather than, I wouldn't want someone to come away thinking from this, hearing me play high Ds and thinking, oh, I can write high Ds, but I shouldn't use tenor clef. I should use 37 ledger lines, or however many that is. I think it's 5. I don't know. Thankfully, most people don't make bassoonists read high Ds and bass clef. So if you do write up in that register, I would personally prefer tenor clef. And it does happen. So if I look over here right on my stand, this is the kind of a project that I'm working on. This is the Daniel Dorff Contrabassoon Concerto. If there is a standard Contrabassoon Concerto, this is it. So here, there's some tenor clef in there. Going up to the high B. Completely reasonable use of tenor clef. Now, this piece also has some examples of... so here's another one. Towards the front in that cadenza. We have all these grace notes up in high C. Perfectly good use of tenor clef. Now, there is also some ridiculous ledger lines in here, but there's a very good reason for that. So if we look right before rehearsal 104... Sorry, if I knew I was going to do this, I would prepare examples. We have this kind of ridiculous passage where that high C is written with a whole bunch of ledger lines, but that's because of this low C beforehand. If that high C if the high C had been approached in a more reasonable way, it would have used tenor clef in this instance. So it does happen. I don't think if you write in this register, I wouldn't avoid it, but be careful writing up here. Sorry, now that part's in my head. So it's octave. Yeah, it's very it's that very rewarding kind of hard where it's possible, but it's really challenging. So the MP Kev asked, can the notes above high C be played on every contrabassoon? Only I could find until C and higher notes needed key adjustments, light air leak. Okay, so it kind of sounds like you looked at my fingering chart. So in that fingering chart, I do talk about some of those high notes and how they might need a key adjustment. I feel like every contrabassoon can play up to the C sharp. Well, except apparently this one right now. So that's the C sharp, 2 ledger lines above tenor clef. It's only when you get to the D where it might depend on the contrabassoon. And honestly, if you're a composer, I would save this register for, like, someone commissioned me to write a contrabassoon concerto. I'm going to write some notes and give them to them for feedback to see what they think. If it's just a normal orchestral part, I would recommend not going up to the to the D and above. So that's the 3rd ledger line above tenor clef D. If your instrument's set up and you have a good vocal and a good reed, it can work. But there's also a lot of caveats in this register. So even when you can play up to the D and the E, some slurs work, some slurs don't. So like if I'm slurring from D to E, it works more often than not. But if I'm trying to go from C to E, it just doesn't work. So if I were asked to do something like that, I would either have to articulate the E and hope that my water key isn't clogged, or add some slurs, or add some notes, I should say. And even that E is sharp without the water key. So I try to practice up to the A flat above treble clef. But I need to do some more tweaks on this instrument. I mentioned earlier that something I did changed the response on that high G and high A flat, so I'm having to pinch more than I would want. Like right now, it's just that very thin that I really wouldn't want to use in a performance. I want to have fingerings that I can kind of play nice and open rather than having to bite. So right now I'm kind of focusing in kind of the bassoon range, so up to high E, or high E or high F. Okay, so sorry, I can't let this pass. Ratchet asks, why not write an 8 VA over that high C? Well, as a woodwind player, my personal opinion is that 8 VA has zero place in woodwind writing. Like, absolutely none. That is... So, 8 VA makes a lot of sense on, like, piano, right? I'm playing dispatches, move my hand up an octave, use the exact same fingerings, on contrabassoon and on any woodwind, when you get to that extreme range, these fingerings are not the same fingerings as an octave below. They're completely different fingerings. So the ledger lines and clef changes are actually easier for most woodwind players would and I think most woodwind players would tell you the same thing. Like in this situation where it has to stay in bass clef because of the rapid leaps, I would much rather read ledger lines than read 8 VA. Yeah. Sans the skeleton says, not just woodwind writing, all instruments that aren't repeatable is good for harps and keyboards. Yeah, and there are some exceptions. Like when you get into the ridiculous trumpet range, where pretty much every fingering gives you the same note, 8 VA can be okay. And I'm talking like Maynard Ferguson screeching, not like Zarathustra high Cs. But I'm trying to think. Yeah, like so. Take the flute for example. The flute can technically play some crazy high, like E flat 7, E7, F7, F sharp 7, but up in that range, I do think it's okay to use 8 VA, where you know you're writing notes that legitimately are unfamiliar to an orchestral player. They just don't happen in the orchestra. But when in doubt, no 8 VA in woodwinds. Yeah, so Ratchet, in this situation, and once again, just to remind everyone of what I'm talking about, where we have the rapid leaps across the register, I think this is the best notation. C, C, and then C with a whole bunch of ledger lines. It's not perfect, because that C is a little uncomfortable to read, But rapid ledger line switching back and forth would be, rapid clef changes back and forth would be more disruptive in this example than a whole bunch of ledger lines. But generally, all of that was just a really long-winded way of saying 8VA don't use on woodwinds unless you have a really good reason. And on brass, unless you're dealing with like stupidly low tuba pedals, like F0 or something crazy like that, or Maynard Ferguson trumpet stuff, or, you know, yeah, it's just more trouble than it's worth. Okay. So now we have the much requested key. I don't know why it was requested, but it's time for B sharp major. And on those particular slurs, so that's B sharp, C double sharp, D double sharp, E sharp, they work on this instrument, but on if it could be slightly different notes, some of those slurs just wouldn't work at all. So that's why if you write up in this range, it should be for a soloist, and you should have the opportunity to show them the music and get their feedback. So I do a little bit of engraving, so I'm gonna weigh in on this a little bit. So the conversation is on woodwinds, since you're not using 8VA in the parts 99.9% of the time, is it okay to use it in the score? My argument would be yes. I don't see anything wrong with having 8VA in the score if it makes things you know, a lot of times if you're dealing with a full orchestra, that space, it's tight to get all those staves on one page in the best of circumstances. So if using a little bit of 8VA in kind of less than ideal circumstances achieves that, I think that's absolutely fine. I think the music in the score, it should have all of the information that the parts have, but I think it's okay if it's not presented, that information isn't presented in exactly the same way. So like clef changes, I don't think there's anything wrong with having different clefs in the part than the score. A perfect example of this is like second bassoon parts. Second bassoon parts are notorious for really low tenor clef. And this comes from, so when the first bassoon and second bassoons are written in octaves, in the full score, they appear on one staff. And you might have things like a low A written in tenor clef because the first bassoon is, you know, going up to high A later in that
So what happens a lot of times is when those parts get extracted into individual parts, the first bassoon is happily in tenor clef because they're playing in the upper register. Why wouldn't they be in tenor clef? And then the poor second bassoonist is reading like low A's and low G's in tenor clef. So that's, to me, that's a perfect illustration of, you know, an example or why it's not always a good idea or not always necessary to have the same information presented in the exact same way in the score and the parts. Because that's going to be an unhappy second bassoonist who has to read low A's, low B, or low A's, low G's, low F's, B in tenor clef. Now, I would say I do kind of agree about the when it comes to 8VA, I do think the normal rule should apply. So kind of like the normal rule is that you don't use 8VA below treble clef, and you don't use 8VA above bass clef. You should do a clef switch for that, and I kind of think that should apply for scores as well. So luckily on most of the bass clef instruments, if you find yourself with limited space in the score, you can just switch to tenor clef. Or if it's a score and it doesn't appear in the parts, I don't have a problem with it appearing in treble clef. Or for that matter, you know, whatever clef. I mean, conductors should be able to deal with treble, alto, tenor, and bass clef, as long as that doesn't appear in the player's part. Like, I know a lot of times if I'm writing in C, or if I'm like arranging music in concert pitch, I put the horns in tenor clef, because it saves me from a whole bunch of clef changes back and forth that aren't going to apply anyway when I put it in horn notation a fifth higher. Okay, back to the much requested B sharp major. Whoa, okay, that's not right. I started two different metronomes. So I'm actually having to use as a metronome for whatever so my computer is about 7 years old. In order for it to encode the stream, my metronome won't work. So if I turn on my normal metronome, and that's supposed to be steady. So instead, what I have is an audio file of a metronome, and I'm just playing that on loop. Yeah, generally, so now we're talking about alto clef for horn parts. In a score, I would have no problem with that. Personally, though, when I'm I make my scores in transpose notation, you know, like standard orchestral practice. I know film scores are different, but me, and I'm a live orchestra guy, so I use that practice. So I would have my score be in F, in, you know, transposed pitch. If I needed to put it in concert pitch, yeah, I'd have no problem putting the horn and alto clef, and I would generally agree that alto clef is better than tenor clef. Honestly, I'm not allowed to say this because I'm a bassoonist. Tenor clef is kind of dumb. Like, there should be 3 clefs. Tenor clef shouldn't really exist. Like, it should just be alto clef, right? They're so similar to one another. It would save a lot of trouble, but that's not going to change. For the situation you're talking about where you have a score and it doesn't really matter how it's notated for the players because they're not going to be seeing it, alto clef is perfectly fine. If a bassoon part appears in alto clef in the score, no problem. If it appears in my part, I'm going to post pictures of it on Facebook and make fun of it. And I've done it before because it has appeared in my part. might be able to hear there that the low C on this instrument tends to be a little bit flat, which is weird as a bassoonist because generally the low notes are sharp. But there is actually a reason for that. So ideally, this is the tone hole for low C. It's the one closed by the low B key. Ideally, it would be like right on this tenon. So they've relocated it a little bit further down the instrument for the sake of making the instrument more easier manufacture of the instrument. But as a result, that low C is flat. So if I just play it normally, that's about 11" flat. By the way, I have a tuner over here. I don't have perfect pitch. Now, luckily, especially in the low register, the normal tendency on bassoon is to be too firm, to voice these notes too high. So on contrabassoon, it's not that difficult to bring this low C into tune, especially if it's soft. If it's loud, sometimes I'll actually push in my tuning slide. For that, normally I'm not an advocate of using the tuning slide. I think a lot of people use it too much to make up for reed inconsistencies. So they make a reed that's not quite in tune with the instrument, so they just fix it with the tuning slide. The problem with that is when you change the tuning slide, you're also changing the positioning of the octave vents relative to the rest of the bore of the instrument. So it can cause some unforeseen issues. But it is a nice emergency tool to have in your back pocket. So like, for example, if, let's say I was playing Hindemith, Symphonic Metamorphoses, and I had that, monstrously long pianissimo low B flat. I don't want to spend that entire time trying to play super soft and bring the pitch down 30 cents. So I would pull the tuning slide all the way out like I just did. And even that was on the sharper side. So I actually have a slightly longer bell that I would probably use in that situation. It messes up some the tone on the low C, but if I need a really soft, perfectly in tune, effortless low B flat, I would use a longer bell for that. Okay. So C minor. Drifting flat on me. You can when I'm playing down in this low register, once again, it's hard to not accidentally do the bassoon fingerings. So without the C sharp key for the low D. So, it's kind of like speaking a foreign language. The hardest aspects are the things that are almost the same as your native language, but just slightly different. So, here, so on instruments that are entirely different, like clarinet or saxophone, it's easy to think of them as just their own unique thing. But on contrabassoon and bassoon, since they are superficially similar as far as where the keys are and what the keys do, it can be, if you're not paying enough attention, it's easy to mess up. Okay. So Ratchet asks what I think of Brett Newton's Great Bassoon Project. Completely in favor. Excited to see what he comes or how it works out. I've helped just a little bit, kind of in the limited way I've been able to, while still kind of focusing on the sub-contrabassoon project. But it's it's exciting. I want more innovation in double reeds. So now I think Brett's a little more optimistic than I am about the utility of a great bassoon in the orchestra. The orchestra is so kind of traditionally minded, and the instrumentation is so fixed that I do think it would struggle to get a foothold there. I think that smaller combinations of instruments where the unique timbre of an instrument between a bassoon and a contrabassoon would be a more successful setting. But I would love to be proven wrong about that. Okay. C sharp. So, definitely one of the less comfortable keys on bassoon and contrabassoon, especially because you have that C sharp, D sharp right at the beginning. Not a good idea in that situation. Now you might be able to hear that if you play bassoon, you'll recognize that sound, that where it's trying to come out in 2 octaves at once on a bassoon. That would tell you I'm either not half holding enough or I need to flick that note. Here, it tells me that the contrabassoon is still a very imperfect instrument. So if we look along this tube here, this is our upper octave vent, way up here. And then we have 2 lower octave vents down here towards the tuning slide. But on a traditional contrabassoon, there's nothing in this register. And ideally, there would be an octave vent for kind of like C sharp, D, and E flat. C sharp is probably kind of the, well, I don't know. They're all pretty squirrely notes. So that's why that sound is happening. So this reed is probably on its way out. I love this reed, but I'll need to... It's probably one of the last practice sessions I'll be able to... Or last productive practice sessions I'll be able to get out of it. Sharp. I think I need to... yeah, that's kind of what I was talking about before. That that this reed is wearing out a little bit on me. Sorry. Ratchet asked, the D flat above the staff has some weird harmonics. Do you know why? Yeah, that's because that note's almost on the verge of collapsing, and playing down in the upper octave. So if I try to play that note with a very without adjusting it, it tries to do both octaves at once, because the contrabassoon doesn't really have an appropriate harmonic vent for this note, or at least this contra doesn't. Some contrabassoons have another octave key that's used exactly for this middle register. So I need a new reed for this, and that's my plan for later this week. Okay. urge to, when I'm teaching bassoon lessons, I call this trumpet playing syndrome, which is when you get in this upper register, the natural tendency is to work harder, to kind of, oh, I'm playing high, I have to push something, I have to tense. And on bassoons, you're just going to go sharp. On contrabassoons, sometimes you need to do that because the instrument isn't designed to play in this range, but it's still easy to go too far with that and end up really sharp. And that was kind of an example there when I tried to go up to the high D and I got a little carried away and it ended up not as a nice open resonant in tune D, but as a pinched squeaky E. And that's not the sound you want. In the rare event that you have to play in this register, you don't want to sound like that last one. The best gamer of ever 23. Here's a challenge. Do the Figaro Overture on Contra. Yeah, thankfully that's not in the original score. And then, of course, if this were an audition, they'd make you do that passage that comes later with the repeated A's. See, that's what I want the G to come out as. Without a lot of pinching. But unless I'm slurring to that from the F sharp, with the Contra as it is right now, that G's not wanting to happen. Unless I really bite. Well, even now. I'm being challenged right now to do the Ravel, the G major piano concerto, that thing. No, what? I don't even know if I still have that on my computer. I mean, well, okay, it's definitely, that excerpt's definitely on my computer somewhere, but who knows how it's saved, and I'd have to play it so slow. Yeah, I'm not seeing it easily accessible on here. Oh. Oh, no. I mean, there's that, the really high solo is actually... Except for the gurgling on the high E, because the water key is full. Yeah, but I already did a video of that. Yeah. Because once again, it's on here. That excerpt's on my computer somewhere, but wait. Is that where it is? No. Wait, maybe. Okay, yeah, so here's that excerpt. Yeah, so if you've never played this before, this is one of the kind of the more technically demanding bassoon excerpts out there. And it's actually the second bassoonist has it harder. Now, of course, the E flat on contrabassoon has a different fingering, so. Yeah, so I would need to, and it should be, of course, much faster than that. Yeah, so thankfully that's not a contrabassoon excerpt, so that's not something I really have to worry about. I would need to. So like right there, I have F, E flat, B flat. Now, since I'm using the full fingering for F there, I don't want to slide this finger over to get to the E flat, so I'm using thumb E flat. But then I have the B flat immediately after that. So in this situation, I would, oh, sorry, I'm not really in frame, am I? In this situation, I would actually use this key that on bassoon is almost useless, but on bassoon, contrabassoon actually comes in handy every once in a while. This front B flat key, because if you're slurring from thumb E flat to B flat, it's much easier than to do that than sliding the thumb down. So here, F, E flat, B flat, C. And same thing again. And if you've never taken an audition before, so in the original parts, this is written to be divided between two bassoons. But in auditions, they normally want you to play both parts in one go. And then on contrabassoon, you're pretty much done with breath at that point. And then it's just more of those arpeggios. It's weird, because if you look at the part, those arpeggios look like the most difficult part, but they're actually like especially on contrabassoon, because you've practiced the heck out of Beethoven 5, so C major arpeggios should be like automatic, but it's all of this kind of like squirrely stuff. Now, I guess I might go as far to say that it's actually maybe a little easier on contrabassoon because you don't have those forked E flats to worry about. You have an actual E flat fingering. So on bassoon, you would have to do da 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 da. There's a lot more forked fingerings in there. Whereas contrabassoon, it's mainly a matter of choosing the alternate fingerings intelligently. So like E flat, B flat, usually using the front fingering. I don't know. This might be something worth spending a little bit of time on and actually recording. Kind of maybe not up to bassoon tempo, but you know, a little faster than I just did it and a little better. So yeah, so the Beethoven 5, the contrabassoon part has all of these C major arpeggios. They kind of cover the range of the instrument. And on pretty much every contrabassoon audition, you're going to be asked to play that. And also, this is Beethoven and Brahms is, if you're thinking of getting into contrabassoon, anytime you get ready to rehearse Beethoven and Brahms, you need to be prepared for the very high possibility that at some point the conductor is going to say just strings and contrabassoon. So you need to not only have practiced the part enough that you can play it, but you can also sound good when isolated with the other strings. I don't know about everybody else, but for me, kind of the most stressful part of a production, it's not the performance. It's the first rehearsal. Because that's when I'm showing up and I'm playing my part for my colleagues who, I mean, I don't want to disparage the audience, but my colleagues are much pickier, much more discerning than the audience will ever be. So that first rehearsal, I want to, sound good for that. And then, the concert, the audience, they'll enjoy it. I mean, maybe in bigger cities, the audience is full of people that are, looking through their score, making notes about, how many notes are gone wrong. But in Arkansas and Oklahoma, the audiences are people that just, they like classical music and they think it's neat that people are playing it. Okay, so I think I'm gonna call it a stream. I didn't get through all of the scales, but I also did a lot of ranting and raving throughout that. For all of you who came for this weird little experiment, and especially if anyone stayed through the whole thing, that's kind of hard to imagine, but I don't know. I guess we're all struggling to come up with things to do. So if you're lucky enough to have your instrument nearby, hopefully now can be a time to do some reed making and practice some technique. All of that stuff that you normally put off because, well, I would love to spend some weeks just focusing on scales, but I have this audition coming up, or I have this concert coming up, or juries, or etudes. So now is the perfect time to kind of take a step back and focus on that, if you're lucky enough to be able to do that. Like a lot of us are going to end up like trying to figure out what kind of job we can do in the meantime, because I'm probably never gonna. It's probably going to be March before I get my not March. It's probably going to be September before I get my next orchestra paycheck. The way things are going. So if you have your instrument nearby and you have time, it's a great way to spend some time. If let's say you're home from school and your instrument's stuck at school, maybe a good time to focus on score reading or music theory or something like that. So there is a few other questions that I missed. When I was talking about Beethoven 5, the Contrabassoon part, that was from the fourth movement. The Contrabassoon, the part as written is tacit for movements 1 through 3. Now, whether or not it was actually played like that in Beethoven's time is a subject for maybe another ranty video. And then there was another question of, what are my opinions of the fast system contrabassoon? So the fast system some of the problems I was talking about before, how the contrabassoon doesn't have enough octave vents. So these octave vents are just, so the range of the contrabassoon is like 40 notes, right? We don't have 40 tone holes. So we have to reuse some of those tone holes. And the way that we do that is by playing a note in the basic scale. So let's take an A. And then we add to that an octave key. And that octave key opens a little vent, which causes the air column to kind of divide in two. So if you've ever played a string instrument and you've played a harmonic, it's the same idea. So adding that key lets it play in the upper octave. And you can also use these vents to play in the third harmonic. So this upper octave key, when you, so like let's take a low G. If I open this first finger, that's going to automatically open a vent that's going to cause the second harmonic. So if you look down right here, you'll see that little vent open. But I can also use the wrong octave key to play a third harmonic of that. Now that's not a very good example because it's placed so incorrectly. But so those are the default contrabassoon has 4 octave vents. One here that's used for D through high G. 2 octave vents that are right here, 1 and 2, and these are coupled together, and those are used for A to C sharp. Well, that C sharp's kind of collapsing a little bit. And then there's the half-hole harmonic vent that's used for F sharp through. So ratchet, when I was playing those octave Fs, I wasn't meaning to. I was holding the instrument up and I was accidentally closing the one of the tone holes with my knee. That's why it was playing F and F, and the upper F was really sharp because I wasn't intending to do that. I was intending to play G, G. So a fast system contrabassoon takes those octave vents and adds more of them. Specifically, it adds one in the middle here and an automatic mechanism to decide which one to use. It is a huge improvement More octave vents means more options for those upper notes. For those like the third, fourth, fifth harmonics. And it also means that you have much less difficulty in the C sharp, D, E flat area because there's a middle octave key and vent to use. The difficulty is that they're about $45,000. The second bassoonist in the Symphony of Northwest Arkansas has one, and she loves it. I can't justify it. But, once again, I guess I didn't really talk about this. I think that anyone spending time innovating on the contrabassoon is something that should be encouraged and supported. The most recent Foxes are, I've been very impressed with the last several that I've tried. I've never really gotten, what you would really need is several hours in a quiet practice room to kind of gauge an instrument. And I've never really had that with a fast system contrabassoon. It's kind of been like, a crowded stage and someone asks me if I want to try it. And I say, oh, sure, I'd love to. But you can't really gauge. It's not a perfect gauge of how well the instrument's going to fit for you. My Contra, this is not my Contra. This is owned by the Symphony of Northwest Arkansas. I picked it out. It lives with me. I'm very lucky to have it to practice because, that's not a given, and I haven't been able to afford to buy my own. If I were to buy my own contrabassoon, I would look very closely at the new Mollenhauers and the new Foxes. Heckles, it's such a long waiting period, and I'll be completely honest, I personally have not played a Heckel contrabassoon that I liked. And that's probably me, because I grew up playing Mollenhauers. So this is not suggesting that Heckel contrabassoons are bad. I haven't played one I liked, and I certainly haven't played one I liked enough to justify the price premium. If money wasn't an issue, I'd be really looking at that Walter Kronwald contrabassoon that I was talking about earlier in the video, because that takes some of the contraforte keywork improvements and combines that with a more traditional contrabassoon, which is much more appealing to me personally. I don't think there's anything wrong with the contraforte. I like the traditional contrabassoon. In the same way that I don't think there's anything wrong with the contrabass clarinet, I don't think there's anything wrong with the French bassoon. I like the German bassoon, and I like the traditional contrabassoon. That's probably just stubbornness and what I'm used to, but that's, at the age of 36, I'm gonna rapidly become stuck in my ways, so that may or may not change. I would say I do plan to keep an open mind on all of these situations, and I do want to talk more about the contraforte in a separate video, because I think there's a lot to talk about there, and it's a question I get a lot. So one last question. Yeah, so this is a Mollenhauer contrabassoon. This was made in about 2000. It was owned by an individual up in Connecticut. So when the Symphony of Northwest Arkansas was starting to get off the ground, they asked me for help picking out a contrabassoon, and I happened to have heard about someone selling their, at that time, quite new Mollenhauer. So I convinced the orchestra to try it out. So they had a local player in Connecticut try it out with all of us on the phone in like a conference call. And then I flew up to Connecticut to do the final play check. And then I ended up, approving. So I got to come back home with it. Now, that is the last time I have flown with a contrabassoon, because that is a whole other ordeal. And generally, I just drive. Like, if for some crazy reason I had the opportunity to go to Europe with a contrabassoon, I would consider flying, but other than that, I'm driving. Like if IDRS is in Vancouver one year coming up, it's going to be a long drive, but I'm not dealing with flying. So Arthur asked, what about French contrabassoons? French contrabassoons are, my understanding is that French contrabassoons are essentially German contrabassoons with French keywork. So a French bassoon has significant bore and tone hole differences from a regular bassoon that gives it a very distinct sound. My understanding is that French contrabassoons don't really have that. That it's more or less just a different... the keywork is laid out in a manner that French players would be comfortable with, and that there's less of a timbral difference. Now, there is one interesting aspect of French contras that you'll see sometimes is they'll have, so this top bend for the low B flat and low B, a lot of times on the French instruments it'll be wrapped around in the other direction, which looks bizarre, but I mean, it doesn't really affect the sound. So yeah, now I haven't gotten to play a French contrabassoon. They're very rare, and when they do come up in the used market, they tend to be pretty pricey, and that would be a gamble. If I had the kind of money to buy a French contrabassoon, I would buy a nice Mollenhauer, a nice new Mollenhauer. I couldn't justify taking the risk on an instrument that I am less familiar with. Oh, so Brett's now in chat. Everyone say hi to Brett. I'm trying to think. Yeah, your Great Bassoon project came up a little earlier. So this has kind of been like half scale practice and half random ranting. So yeah, so I think we're gonna call that good for today. It's been about 2.5 hours. Sorry to leave right when Brett comes in, but I hope everyone stays safe and healthy, and I'll probably be seeing you all more the next couple weeks with live streams. Have a good day.